Hi, and welcome to the second piece of our discussion of the Yerushalmi. Some basic things about the Yerushalmi text. The Yerushalmi has Brightot and also Memrot from 5 generations of Amoraim from Eretz Israel. It also has some limited number of Memrot from the first 3 generations of Babylonian Amoraim. You'll recall that the 4th and 5th generations of Babylonian Amoraim, Rav and Abaye, and Rav Ashi, Rav Papa, and Ravina were the Amoraim who clearly knew and responded to Yerushalmi Sugyot. So it is the generations before them that have occasional Memrot in Yerushalmi, but a very limited number. There's only a small fraction of the Memrot of those same Moraim that we find in the Bavli. Yerushalmi Sugyot are, for the most part, edited, and individual sources are tied together into discussions, but in a much more limited way than the Bavli. The Bavli has entire discussions and analyses of its sources in an anonymous back-and-forth discussion that we call the Stam. This is an editorial layer in the Bavli that is chronologically later than even the latest quoted sources, and it's often significantly later than any of the formal Memrot. The Yerushalmi did not have that extended time of post-Amoraic expansion. It has comments and brief notes. It questions a few words here and a few words there. It has phrases to tie sources together or explain them, but there's not a whole separate layer. Nonetheless, we do know that it went through some kind of editing. We see this clearly from a section we'll talk about more a bit later called Yerushalmi Nizikin. The first 3 Masechtot of Seder Nizikin, what's sometimes called Masechet Nizikin, which we call Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, right? Which really just mean part 1, part 2, first part, middle part, last part. The Yerushalmi on Masechet Nizikin is of a different redaction than the rest. And while the question of exactly how Yerushalmi Nizikin is related to the rest of the Yerushalmi, and why in the Yerushalmi that was preserved we have this version of these 3 Masechtot and this other version of all the rest of the Masechtot is a super complicated question. But regardless of how we answer that question, what we can say for sure is that the version of Yerushalmi material in Masechet Nizikin, in Yerushalmi Nizikin, is an earlier form of the Yerushalmi text. It represents what the Yerushalmi looked like at an earlier stage in its redaction. And that's really a weird random thing that we have and a powerful insight. Yerushalmi Nizikin is a listing of sources that have been collected but not woven together. It looks like a catalog of unrelated quotes linked by theme, like Bartlett's quotations. This was the Yerushalmi at an earlier stage. The difference from the rest of the Yerushalmi is sharp. In the rest of the Yerushalmi, the sources are connected, compared, and tied together into a structure. Even though that structure is often much shorter than what we're familiar with in Bavli, they are nonetheless sugyot, built from multiple sources. And Yerushalmi Nezikin is at one stage of development, but the entire rest of the Yerushalmi was edited in roughly the same way with consistent terminology and style. This means that everything except for Yerushalmi Nezikin was redacted by one person or group roughly at the same time. A few different things in terms of comparing the Bavli to the Yerushalmi to the Bavli. In the Bavli, a full 1/3 of the Bavli is Agadah, all sorts of material that is not explanation of the Mishnah, stories and theology and midrash, all sorts of stuff. The Yerushalmi does have what we call agadic material. Such material makes up only about a sixth of the Yerushalmi compared to a third of the Bavli. But more importantly, that agadic material, like with the Tosefta, is not woven in with the other material. The Agadah in the Yerushalmi is inserted in large chunks. So you have the sort of regular commentary on the Mishnah, discussing various issues of law, and then entire sections of an entire section of stories about a certain group of rabbis, a whole chunk of midrash on a certain biblical text or whatnot. This leads to essentially the same conclusion that we came to with regard also to the Midrash Halacha, which is that even though 1/6 of the Yerushalmi is Agadah, probably 80% of that material was originally redacted separately in collections of stories or midrashim or of other kinds, and then inserted en bloc into various places in the Yerushalmi at some point. When you set those blocks of text aside, the Yerushalmi really is very consistently, much more consistently than the Bavli, focused on halacha and on commenting on, clarifying, explaining, and discussing the Mishnah. It sticks to that mission and focus in a much more consistent way. Part of that is that the rabbis in Eretz Israel were composing a variety of types of material, and this gets back to the genre question that we touched on at the beginning. They were composing in various genres that were kept separate. When we talk about Midrash Agadah, the kind of filling in story midrashim that we're so familiar with, the homiletic midrashim about morality and kindness and caring for the poor, all of those collections of midrash were compiled in Eretz Israel in roughly this time period. And that's where their midrashic material went. The Babylonian rabbis didn't do midrash as a separate genre. All of the early liturgical writing, the Tefillah and Piyutim, were composed in Eretz Israel at this time. The Bavli does not have separate texts like that. Everything was put into the one collection. In other words, the Yerushalmi is the halachic commentary in the Mishnah, and other collections had other material. The Babylonian rabbis, and they say this about themselves, put all of their material, all of their eggs into one basket. Anything they wanted to preserve went into the Bavli, which is why the Bavli often meanders between genres. Now I want to focus on talking about some of the key features of the Yerushalmi text. About some of the things that make that text difficult to work through and make sense of, why it's remained marginal across the centuries, and we're going to talk about some of the reasons that it is so critical and how it opens up new ways of understanding those other texts. So we saw that there's very little Agadah, outside of those inserted blocks, there's a much more consistent focus on explaining the Mishnah, and there are other types of collections. Now, the first thing to understand about the Yerushalmi is that it didn't have an extended period of redaction the way the Bavli did. That means there isn't any of the extended anonymous back and forth discursive material that you find in the Bavli. That part of what we have in the Bavli is totally missing here. It also means that the language wasn't smoothed out in the same way. Essentially, we know that early in the Amoraic period, the first sources connected to the Mishnah were just being gathered and arranged. And it grew gradually from there. This is unlike the Mishnah, which was put together at a specific moment. The Yerushalmi, we know, grew through accretion. There were other Amoraic teachings that were collected in other ways, or that were taught not connected to a Mishnah, but very early on, Braitot and Memrot were being collected and organized, attached to specific Mishnayot. This means that on each Mishnah, you first just had a collection of relevant Braitot and Memrot, and only after that did the editorial process begin, where they started to figure out the relationship between those sources, to specify the connections between the sources and the Mishnah, and often to pull together several sources into a slightly more extended discussion. In the Yerushalmi, unlike the Bavli, that has been done kind of minimally. So there's a great deal that has to be kind of intuited, and gaps that need to be filled in order to figure out what sort of overall message it's conveying. So the first key feature is that Yerushalmi Sugyot are terse and leave much to be reconstructed. Yerushalmi Sugyot also end abruptly in a very different way than the Bavli. Partially that is a lack of polishing and of an extended editorial process, and partially it's the style of the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is, as we said, focused on explaining the Mishnah. It identifies a problem with the Mishnah, will offer a solution, perhaps a memra that clarifies the problem, maybe a response or a comment, and then boom, moving on to the next topic. Where we would have more language signals and more of a sense in the Bavli of a whole unit of thought, the Yerushalmi has short, single questions and answers, and then moving on. Yerushalmi also doesn't have nearly as much of the guiding technical terminology as the Bavli, which is another thing that contributes to the sense the Yerushalmi will sometimes just kind of stop and move abruptly on to the next topic when it seems like we're not there yet. That said, the Yerushalmi does have a significant amount of technical terminology. Now, often, the Yerushalmi's terminology is analogous to what to Bavli terminology. That's perhaps more familiar, but not identical. There'll be a slightly different phrase in the Yerushalmi that serves the exact same logical or structural function as a particular technical term or phrase in the Bavli. Nonetheless, a student of the Bavli might have seen it multiple times and be very familiar with how it works and what function it serves logically. But the Yerushalmi term will seem strange. When you encounter a technical phrase in the Yerushalmi that is parallel to a Bavli phrase, you need to make the connection and remember, this really is functionally identical to this other term, and therefore I know how it works. You need to be able to make and to draw those connections, because in learning Yerushalmi Sugya, we're inevitably doing a lot of inferring about what it seems the Sugya is trying to say. Those familiar logical structures are lifesavers. So there's the lack of editorial smoothing and polish, the laconic and sometimes opaque sugyot, the fact that the Yerushalmi is his own library of technical terminology. Also, the language, the Yerushalmi uses a somewhat different form of Aramaic, and therefore looks even more unfamiliar if one is familiar with the Bavli. And the fourth thing that makes the text challenging goes back to the question of transmission. The text of the Yerushalmi that we have is full of errors. It's full of them, and there are no resources to go back and clarify or correct them. And there's no whole bevy of different manuscripts or external textual witnesses. There are more resources now than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. There are some Geniza fragments of sections of the Yerushalmi where they have problems of their own. There are a few snippets of manuscript, but they're very few and of low quality. And many of the errors in the Yerushalmi text predate any manuscript evidence that we have. There are errors that are clearly errors that got into the text that are found in the same place in every textual witness we do have. Which means that those errors got into the text further back than our manuscript trail can possibly lead us. When we compare manuscripts of the Bavli and we find differences, those differences are usually pretty minor. To be sure, those minor things can make a big difference in some cases, but they're minor differences. The Yerushalmi has textual problems on an entirely different scale. There are entire lines or statements that are skipped because a scribe skipped from one use of a word to the next use of the word 2 lines below and skipped a couple of lines. There are reversals where the thing that is supposed to be patur is chayav, and the person who's supposed to be exempt is obligated, and the person supposed to be obligated is exempt. There are places where no and yes get switched, which obviously makes quite a bit of difference. There are sentences that you look at and you're really guessing at what it originally said. All of these things make the Yerushalmi challenging to work through and make sense of. And also is both a cause and a result of the fact that it was treated as marginal for most of rabbinic history. We'll get that in a minute. Let me emphasize that. For significant parts of the history of rabbinic scholarship, of learning, and I don't mean academic scholarship, but across the last 1,100 years of the transmission of Torah, for much of that time, the Yerushalmi was by and large ignored, except for a couple of brief periods as the result of the renewed interest of a couple of crucial figures in the rabbinic community. Even today in yeshivot, it might be taken out to check a reference on occasion, but people rarely sit down and try to learn the Yerushalmi in depth. This is a result of the unfamiliar language and the textual difficulty, and also its cause. People know Bavli terminology because of the time they've spent reading sugya after sugya and seeing those terms used in multiple contexts. They don't have that experience with the Yerushalmi. Frankly, this is unfortunate. There's a lot left on the table when the Yerushalmi is not part of the library of resources we use to understand the Bavli, or even seen as a separate crucial station in the growth of the Masorah. Right. I'm going to pause with that now and look at some concrete aspects of how the Yerushalmi works. Maybe going over things a little bit that we've mentioned before, but I want this piece to be clear. There's a redaction, but that redaction is far less visible. You mostly have sources which are arranged with language indicators connecting them, brief questions or explanations, and guideposts, but there isn't extra material. Yerushalmi Sugyot tend to be purely commentary. If there's a question, the Sugya stays focused on that question, offers an answer. Anybody who's gone through any of those long, tortuous Bavli Sugyot knows that the Bavli does not do that. It starts in one place and through a roundabout set of connections, it digresses or goes far afield. It might begin with one basic question, and in theory, stay focused at length on that question. And in the process of going back and forth, asking, do we follow Abaye or Rava in this one thing, they tie in numbers of seemingly unconnected or tendentially related topics and weave them into a grand facade. There's none of that more elaborate composition in the Yerushalmi. Most of the Yerushalmi goes through and addresses discrete problems piece by piece. Yeah. What that means is, what you get in the Yerushalmi is essentially an earlier version of the Talmud that we know. This is where I said earlier the Yerushalmi is not a parallel attempt to do the same thing, but less developed. The Yerushalmi is the frame, the structure on which the Bavli was built. This has been the subject. This question of how much of the Yerushalmi did the Babylonian Amoraim, as opposed to the later Gaonim, have, and when did they have it, has been the subject of a great deal of scholarly jibber-jabber and hand-wringing and argumentation. There are particular elements of this that are unclear or open to question and probably will remain so. But as a basic idea, it is incontrovertibly true. By the fourth and certainly fifth generation of Babylonian Amoraim, they had the Yerushalmi, most of it, all of it, whatever, and constructed and started organizing their own teachings and material around the Yerushalmi's structure. In sugya after sugya, in huge parts of the two Talmudim where there is parallel material, and we'll see some examples of this, you see the Yerushalmi sugya and the Bavli sugya asking the same questions, using mostly the same sources and often the same kind of language. You'll often see that the Bavli has done something with the material that the Yerushalmi didn't, that takes the Yerushalmi material a couple steps further. Now, remember that the Yerushalmi has some Babylonian teachings, but only in limited quantity, and only early ones. So some Torah traveled from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael and made it into the Yerushalmi. But vast amounts of Eretz Yisrael material, both Yerushalmi Sugyot and Memrot of a variety of Amoraim, was brought from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel and was incorporated into the Bavli. Furthermore, the Bavli was completed, it was redacted, and reached its final form 150 to 200 years later than the Yerushalmi, to the best that we can reconstruct the dating. The latest named Babylonian Amoraim, who knew the Yerushalmi, probably lived through the 430s or so, but the transmission and development of the anonymous stratum and the further editing and elaborating of the Talmud as a whole continues in Bavel through the end of the 6th century at least. For all of these reasons, it is a rule of thumb that has been confirmed in all sorts of ways that unless you have specific evidence to the contrary, when you see a parallel sugyot in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, which you see all the time, or when there's any kind of shared content and material, they did not develop independently. And the Yerushalmi version is the earlier of the two versions. And the Bavli sugya takes the Yerushalmi material, reworks it sometimes, builds on it, accepts its conclusions, and takes the ideas a step forward. They received Yerushalmi material and continued to develop, which means that the Yerushalmi is essentially the raw material out of which what we know of as the Bavli was constructed. And in any process of trying to reconstruct what something is, why it is the way it is, how it came to be, that kind of snapshot of here's the material at an earlier stage in its development. Here's what this tradition looked like before this last stage of editing is absolutely invaluable. Now, I want to make a distinction here between the Yerushalmi as a literary product and real practice in Eretz Israel. In the Jewish community in Israel, and among the rabbis of Eretz Israel, there was a whole separate world of minhagim and halacha that developed separately from the Babylonian community. There's actually an entire book, one of the few real freestanding works from the early Gaonic period, meaning the 8th century, that is a list of differences in halacha and minhag between the communities of Israel and Babylonia. The list is quite long. And there are times when a Yerushalmi sugya will reflect what we know from that or other sources to be the Eretz Yisrael practice. And we see that sugya having been reworked by the Babylonians to, among other things, reflect the realities and culture and practices of Babylonian Jewry as opposed to the Eretz Yisrael community. These practices developed independently, and the communities kind of grew away from each other. The Yerushalmi as a text ended at a certain point and came to Bavel, and what was really preserved going forward, since the Yerushalmi was mostly neglected by almost all generations of later scholars, was the forms of those teachings that we find in the Bavli, right, which obviously have been adapted through the Bavli lens. But now, those differences in minhag and halacha have a huge and fascinating impact on the development of Jewish practice in the following centuries, in the early Middle Ages, especially in Italy and in Ashkenaz. But in terms of the Talmud, the Yerushalmi stopped, came to Bavel, and the Babylonians built on it, They may have edited or expanded the Yerushalmi material. They may have a separate, entirely Babylonian sugya that they placed next to the Yerushalmi sugya and perhaps tried to weave the two together. Okay. The last one more important piece of what you'll see when you compare Yerushalmi and Bavli parallels. The Yerushalmi will often have a series of short sugyot, where the Bavli sometimes ties those units together into a long back and forth debate, ostensibly debating one overarching question, which with each piece brought as evidence one way or the other on the central guiding question. Now, what that means is that many of those longer sugyot originated as smaller discrete units, addressing different often related questions. Each was probably more concise, came to a point or conclusion. Which is in Bavli sugyot are notoriously elusive. And part of the reason that those conclusions are elusive in the Bavli is because that Bavli's primary work was taking a chain of small sugyot and just figuring out a way to make them into a single conversation. That is what the Bavli did with it. Right? Their goal was to make it into a literary unit, not to address and solve a concrete halachic question. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and we will continue with looking at some specific examples in the next session.